So I really like to start by thanking Martha and Sandy, who really have made me a better person for having come to know them over the years. And I really would say I work for them at this point. So I just want to really thank them for allowing us to participate here. I also want to thank Jane and Kristen from RWJ for seeing the wisdom of convening all of you and allowing you to have these 2 days to really share what I think is really critical work. So before I give the award to Jane, I've been spending the last 2 days thinking, why does a small foundation give an award for journalism at the first National Summit on ACEs? So I thought I'd maybe take a minute to think about why it's so important here to say that we should recognize excellence in journalism. So by background, the Scattergood Foundation is only 7 years old. And when we first started to think about where we might have impact, we started to look at the work that journalists were doing and how it might be doing more harm than it was doing good in terms of the work that you all are doing in the community. So we had this idea, maybe we should fund a behavioral health reporter. So we went to the local public radio station and we came in and we said, how about we fund a full-time reporter just to cover behavioral health in Philadelphia? And their eyes lit up, like, it's great, we're going to get money to fund a reporter. And after really having some discussion about where are the relationships between funders and reporters, I think we came to an amazing place. And we now are in our 4th year of funding a full-time behavioral health reporter in Philadelphia at WHYY. Her name is Mike and Scott. And what's been interesting about the trajectory of this is that when we first wrote the grant, we thought, well, would 36 stories in a year be the right number? Like, what's the metrics? How are we going to know if there's impact in this work? So we went with 36. It seemed like the right number. And when we announced the grant, people said, what is a behavioral health reporter going to report on? What is it that they're going to do? So we're now 4 years into this grant. It's probably a flagship grant for us. Miken's covered over 300 stories in that time. And last year alone, she logged over 100 stories. She was here yesterday and today, and she interviewed several of you. I think Dr. Gardner she interviewed. And she really has been recognized for her work, both regionally and nationally. And now she's kind of more our reporter, your reporter. And I think it's great that the field has somebody that they can pick up the phone and ask to come cover a story with some sensitivity. So we do that grant, and then we think, well, we've really not got it right yet. There's still lots of areas that we could do better on. So we thought about a partnership that we formed with the Columbia School of Journalism and the DART Foundation, where we bring regional journalists in for very specific behavioral health topics. And we spend 1 day educating them about the field, the work. And then the second day, we actually bring experts in the field of journalism in to help them craft stories. And we also bring community members from those representative organizations in. And Dr. Anda, who I saw him and I was going to point to him, we actually ran one on youth violence last year, and Dr. Anda was brought in to be a speaker. And what was really interesting was we went around the room and asked the 30-odd journalists what beats were they from. And primarily they were from the crime beat. So they were there covering or learning about youth violence, and they were coming from a crime beat desk. So you can imagine what their editors were asking them to write. So it was really important because when the group left, they really began to say, maybe I need to apply a more public health lens to this, and maybe I need to reach out to those experts to help understand why youth violence is such a big issue in Philadelphia. So, with that, I guess I wanted to recognize, I should have, I'm running here a little bit. I want to recognize 2 fellow funders that are in the room. Joni Schwager from Stoughton Farm, who replicated the full-time journalist in Pittsburgh. So Pittsburgh now has a full-time reporter, and hopefully there's one coming to all of your cities in the not-too-distant future. And also Stone Lee and Kathy Weiss, who have helped fund some of the journalism series, education series. So the natural progression for this is when we have a local reporter, we work to raise the bar for regional journalists, and then it really does speak to how do we recognize excellence. So it really gives me, great pleasure today to thank Jane Stevens for all the work that she does on behalf of you all. And in the last couple of days, I was trying to think of, how do I articulate this? And, we've heard Rob Anda talk about unified field theory. We've heard Andy Gardner talk about pilings that are critical to connections. We've heard a number of you talk about collective impact. And I think that, Jane works to amplify all of that to which you all do. And I think it needs to be recognized. It needs to be focused. And I think without really good journalists, we're not going to have that unified field theory that we so all want. We're not going to have the collective impact. And we are definitely not going to have the pilings and the foundation to really make that happen. So it's really with great pleasure that we award the Scattergood Award for the first Scattergood Award for Journalism Excellence to you, Jane Stevens. And this is for you. And I think there's no better way than to have Jane show her work. So she's going to kind of take you through what she's been doing.
Thank you all. You are my peeps. This is when Martha said that she wanted to do this. I was speechless. I was writerless. I was wordless, because it means so much to me. This as I'll tell you. So I'll just start and tell you the story. So from 1991 to 1994, I had the great good fortune to live in Bali, Indonesia. And early in my stay there, I lived in a bungalow in Ubud, next to a Balinese couple and their 2 children. Now in Ubud, most houses are made of bamboo, which is why late one night, I heard the family return from a visit to the U.S. The flight back is a grueling 21 hours, so it wasn't surprising that around 6 a.m. I heard their 7-year-old boy fussing loudly. Jet-lagged, exhausted, cranky, he didn't want to go to school. His father, Made, was also jet-lagged and tired. The boy cried and complained. Made raised his voice. The boy fussed some more loud words from Dad. And then I heard an unusual sound for Bali. Whop. Made smacked his kid. Not hard, but he smacked him nonetheless. The boy wailed, not in pain, but in betrayal, as if he had never been hit before. Later that day, a friend and I saw Made inside the compound of the bungalows where we lived. He was sitting on a rock, and he was eating a cucumber. He looked so dejected, as if he'd lost his best friend. My friend couldn't help but ask, Made, what's wrong? Are you all right? Made shook his head. He said, I did a horrible thing today. My friend asked, what happened? Made lowered his head. He said, I hit my child. We didn't know how to respond because in the U.S., American parents don't usually fess up to things like that. Made took another bite out of his cucumber and continued. So I went to the doctor. Doctor? You went to the doctor, my friend said. What did the doctor say? He told me to eat 3 cucumbers a day and stop eating meat for 3 weeks. Well, I forgot to get this going. Hello? And next slide. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So Yes, meats contain androgens and, next slide, cucumbers contain estrogens, but not enough to change a person's behavior. And the doctor knew that. But the point of going to the doctor is that Made recognized that he was the one who'd been out of control. His son was just acting normally. Next slide. In Bali, they have their share of ACEs, but generally speaking, the Balinese have integrated into their culture a profound approach to preventing child abuse. I mean, think of all the things that have to change here to get to what they're doing. So I figured the Balinese are Homo sapiens, we're Homo sapiens. If they can do it, we can do it, yeah? Next slide, please. After returning to the US in 1994, I do more reporting about violence epidemiology and realized that my profession is part of the problem. We scare people. We don't provide an accurate picture of violence in our communities, and we don't provide information about how violence can be prevented. Lori Dorfman, director of the Berkeley Media Studies Group, and I start the Reporting on Violence project. This is a long time ago. We encourage news organizations to adopt a data-driven, solution-oriented approach to crime reporting. We advocate providing context, reporting on research, and providing the community with enough information and resources to make informed decisions, both personal and public policy. We make a little headway, but not as much as I hope. Lesson learned. Just because you show smart people good data, it doesn't mean they'll change. It takes more than that. Boy, was I stupid. Nevertheless, it's a rough beginning of trauma-informed or solutions journalism. We need more tools, I thought at that time, but the internet is in its infancy. That's 1997, and Mark Zuckerberg is only 13 years old. Next slide, please. Fast forward to 2004. I'm living in Davis, California. One morning, I read an article in the local Davis Enterprise about the Incest Survivors Speakers Bureau. I set up an interview with its founder, Connie Valentine. So, does the Incest Survivors Speakers Bureau actually get many requests for speakers, I ask? We've had one, she replies. Then she asks me a question. Next slide, please. Have you heard of the ACE study? No. She tells me about it, and life begins to make sense. Isn't that the way it was for all of you? Life begins to make sense. She gives me Dr. Filitti's contact information, who gives me Dr. Anda's contact information. I write my first article about the ACE study in 2005 for the Sunday Focus section of the Sacramento Bee. For the next few years, I go about my main job, modernizing journalism, to take advantage of this new digital world. But the ACE study, and then the neurobiology of toxic stress, and then epigenetics, they hover on the edges of my attention. How can I spend more time reporting on this? How can I write a book about this? About 5 years ago, those paths begin to merge. Next slide, please. In 2008, I moved from California, where I had lived for 30 years, next slide, to the Midwest. For 30 years, I had been so used to, if I wanted snow, to drive to it. It was a real shock to see it showing up in my driveway. At the Reynolds Journalism Institute, I developed a prototype of a local health site that integrated journalism and social media. Then I was lucky enough to find a news organization in Lawrence, Kansas that wanted to try it out. They gave me a staff of 10 brilliant people, and we created, next slide please, Well Commons, the first social journalism health site. The community helped us design it, develop it, and launch it. Anyone who uses her or his real name can post information right alongside the reporters as easily as they do on Facebook. We believe that the community's information was just as important as a journalist. Well Commons changed the conversation of health in Lawrence, Kansas, from a problem-oriented, disease-of-the-week approach to a solutions-oriented approach in which the whole community was involved. It's a social media site. People message each other and work together on local initiatives, including school gardens and local restaurants that promoted smart eating. People said it speeded up their initiatives by months, if not years. We also created a new approach to advertising, and Well Commons was operationally profitable the first year. I left there at the end of 2011 with a goal of developing a financially sustainable network of local social journalism health sites based on Well Commons. But, through this time, I kept reporting on the ACE study, and I knew that communities would not achieve their health goals unless they could talk about childhood adversity. In Lawrence, the couple of times we tried, it was clear we didn't have the language, even though people really wanted to do something about it. Next slide, please. So the network of local health sites was put on hold, and in 2012, I launched ACEs Too High and ACEs Connection and tapped into a nascent social movement. Marshall Gans is a longtime activist and organizer who's now at Harvard. He says that social movements must have stories, structure, and strategies. ACEs Too High is where most of the storytelling occurs. It's aimed at the general public. Stories are important. They motivate people. They provide narratives of a social movement. They address its values. People open their hearts to stories in a way they just don't open their hearts to data. But, as Gans points out, stories are a portal to data, to abstract ideas, to action. They bring people into social movements, and they sustain them there. So some of the stories from ACEs Too High over this last year. Next slide, please. Dave Lockridge is an evangelical pastor. When he heard Vincent Folletti speak, Dave said he realized in his efforts to help his most troubled parishioners, he'd been doing everything wrong. His words, everything wrong. Lockridge closed his church, got a psychology degree, and designed a 26-week course with a workbook that combines epidemiology, neurobiology, and Bible studies. Suddenly, parts of the Bible take on a whole new meaning. Take Proverbs 14:12, King James Version. There is a way which seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. Isn't that long-term consequences of the way we cope with adversity? Next slide, please. A local artist became vice mayor and rallied the people of her community to declare themselves to be the first trauma-informed city in the nation. Everyone in that community is asked to bring a piece, even if it's a small piece, to Peace for Tarpon. And many do in small and large and always creative ways. Next slide, please. Lincoln High School, as you may have heard already from Terry this morning, is an alternative high school in Walla Walla, Washington. It's where they put the throwaway kids, a term I detest. Almost every city has one of these schools. The first year, mainly because they don't know how to deal with these kids, right? The first year after Principal Jim Sporletter implemented trauma-informed practices, suspensions dropped 85% and expulsions dropped 40%. The kids know they're safe and loved there. They say the school is their family. This story touched a nerve in the community. It went viral, and it has had 376,000 page views so far, and people are still looking at it more than a year later. Next slide, please. More journalists and columnists are picking up on ACEs and toxic stress and trauma-informed practices. Each time a story about trauma and resilience, is that a new word? is told, it resonates with more people. Next slide. And last year, a group of journalists launched the Solutions Journalism Network. They believe it's time to change journalism and that newsworthy solutions exist everywhere. So ACEs Too High does stories. ACEs Connection, next slide please, provides structure. It's a social network for you, the people who are implementing or thinking about implementing practices based on ACE and trauma-informed concepts. It uses a do-it-yourself social networking platform called Ning, probably more technology than you want to know, but I'm a geek, so it's got to do that. It works a lot like Facebook, but it has a few more bells and whistles. When I launched ACEs Connection, I really didn't know what it would or should do. So I waited and watched and reported and helped and connected. And out of chaos, chaos that Sandy was talking about earlier, Chris Engel found ACEs Connection. She became the network's resource admin and has made the network much more useful. Every weekday, she posts 8 to 12 summaries and links to ACE-related news, research, and reports. If someone asks for a resource, she's there to help. Who wants some information about trauma-informed programs for homeless women veterans, she'll find it. People began helping each other. Next slide, please. When Leonie Copens asked the network for a good curriculum for school teachers, she received suggestions, which led to more people sharing curricula. Leonie lives in the Netherlands. Next slide, please. People tell their own stories, including Dr. Folletti. Next slide. Members discuss emerging issues in their fields. And next slide, please. They're organizing communities within the larger community to talk and work together in cyberspace and make plans to visit face-to-face. I'm told that this works. We'll give it a shot. So last week, ACES Connection passed the 1,000-member mark. That's a yay! And it's all been word of mouth. That's what's really, really cool about this. That's a critical turning point. And now, thanks to what its participants, you out there, are doing and asking for, I'm pretty clear about the network's potential. The network is poised to help propel this trauma-informed movement faster than any previous social movement. That's because the internet and social media can do things that weren't possible before. The role of ACES Connection is to support community members as they develop their strategies, local strategies, regional strategies, state, national, and international strategies. ACES Connection can be particularly useful on the local level. We know, and so many of us have said it so far in these last 2 days, we know that instituting trauma-informed practices is not a top-down endeavor unless trauma-informed practices are integrated across a local community and all its silos by the members of the community in the way that works for them. We're not going to have much success at changing the current trajectory of more suffering and skyrocketing health costs and criminal justice costs and yada, 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 you know. In the next 2 years, ACES Connection can grow to 10,000 participants with hundreds of groups representing many of this country's 30,000 cities and towns, whose members are institutionalizing resilience. In turn, they provide help and resources to other communities who want to do the same, not just in this country, but internationally. ACES Connection can facilitate the development of a common language, which is why I started this thing, that everyone can understand and use. It can help fuel a consumer movement, a citizen movement, because if it's a social movement, well, you have to involve people from all walks of life, including patients and clients, because they are the ones who vote and who support or don't support public policy. So, what is trauma-informed journalism? In a nutshell, trauma-informed journalism, solutions journalism, doesn't stop at the problem. It looks to see what's being done or not being done, as the case may be, to solve a problem. It provides context, including data. It provides continuity by following a story to its logical conclusion. It provides information about research and access to resources. What do trauma-informed journalists do? They use the power of the internet and social media to create a safe place and a trusted source for their community's members to talk together, work together, and tell their own stories. A Well Commons, an ACES Connection. And what was so cool about Well Commons and what's really getting to be cool about ACES Connection is that it's all of you who say, this is my site. It's not the journalist's site, it's your site. Trauma-informed journalists don't offer solutions, they examine the consequences of acting or not acting. They serve their community by providing enough information to the members of the community so they can make informed decisions. They tell stories that motivate people to express the values of this movement. Sometimes they bring sunshine to dark places because that's what we do. And sometimes they raise issues that the community may be reluctant to address, but that the data show need to be talked about. Specifically, what part does this trauma-informed journalist play in this trauma-informed movement? Well, just as journalism was an integral part of the civil rights movement and the women's movement, journalism can play a critical part in this social movement. In this effort, my goal is yours, that someday we will live in a society where when an adult hits a child or even wants to hit a child, his or her automatic reaction will not be, my kid's behaving badly. It will be, I'm having a problem and I'd better get some help now. And that parent will make a beeline to a counselor, a teacher, a coworker, a neighbor who will offer useful, informed help without shaming, blaming, or extreme punishment. Perhaps that parent will see a doctor. And if that parent does, perhaps one day you physicians will also say, lay off meat for 3 weeks and eat cucumbers 3 times a day. Thank you.